Hey everyone, Will Metz here, or Guillaume Metz, for those of you that can pronounce that in French. And welcome once again to this YouTube channel. Again, I am a guitarist, professional guitarist, a professor of music theory and guitar, and the published author of 2 books on music theory for the self-taught musician. In this YouTube channel, my goal is simple. It is to educate and empower aspiring guitarists or guitarists to become better players, improvisers, and composers through a thorough understanding of music theory and fretboard navigation skills. Again, the reason why I like to teach to self-taught guitarists is, well, for one, a lot of guitarists fall into this category. And for two, I myself am a self-taught guitarist. I did not take any academic training until really later on when I decided to become a professional. And before this, I was trained as an engineer. That's what I studied in school. And that engineering brain of mine really was obsessed with understanding what was happening in music under the hood. It's really kind of impossible for me to learn something or play an instrument, whatever it is, without having some understanding of the theory behind it. I think that knowing theory in anything that you're studying gives you a tremendous amount of power, control, and understanding, and just makes you a better player when it comes to guitar, and also just gives you a better enjoyment of the art. Some people say, well, it takes away my enjoyment, and my experience at least is the total opposite. I really enjoy playing something when I can also have this rational part of my brain be satisfied at the same time. It's not just emotional, it's everything is firing up there. And that to me is where I get the most enjoyment. Now, please understand again that I make these videos available to everyone here for free, but they do take a lot of time to make and it's a lot of work. I'm happy to do it, but what I ask of you in return is very simple. If you enjoy this content, simply click the little subscribe button and the little bell icon. It's totally free and it helps me a lot. It's hard these days to grow a YouTube channel in 2023. There's a lot of content out there, so that really helps. Another thing I wanted to say is a big thank you to all the feedback that I've been having and the new subscribers and people that have been commenting on my videos. I really, truly appreciate it. Again, there's a lot of other content out there, a lot of really good content. And so it means something that you would spend time to sit here in front of my videos and find value in them. So thank you very much. If you're interested in diving deeper into music theory, please check out my 2 books. They were written for people like you. If you're self-taught and you're a guitarist, I wrote these books basically to my past self. Those are the books that I wish I had had when I started this journey of music theory and I had to figure everything out. I don't use any staff notation. It's all diagrams, logic, step-by-step progression and presentation of all the notions. Everything is useful. Everything is applicable, okay? It's not the nerdy theory that is, just for, again, academic talk or people to nerd about useless things. No, it's really practical. It's what music is made of. It's all the applicable theory of music. So please check them out. Volume 1 is about the basics. Now, the basics doesn't mean simple, right? There's just the fundamentals. And then Volume 2 dives deeper into harmony, composition, and improvisation. So really recommend starting with Volume 1. And then once you've digested it, you can move on to Volume 2. I would also like to point out the fact that there are going to be some free resources and documents associated with this video. And you can get these free documents by just clicking on the link below. It'll take you to my website and you simply put in your email and I will send you the resources. And if you don't want to get any further emails, you can totally unsubscribe. After that, it's fine. You'll never hear from me again. But understand that the email is not for just pointless marketing. It's to really try to give you value. So I'll only email you when I think there's something you might be interested in. So it could be a new tip, a new video, or a new course, which, by the way, I am actually working on a course, full online course the results of years of studying, years of coaching, of mentoring, of teaching at a college level, at a private level, kind of condensed everything I've learned with all my clients or students, and made this course. So again, it's packed with exercises. It's a step-by-step progression. I go through all the elements that are in the books. So I go through all the theory, but you get the benefits of having it directly explained and, I would say, applied to the fretboard, right? Because the books are they're for every instrument. It's just music theory. Music theory works for every instrument. So it lacks that direct guitar connection, and that you will get in the course, right? I will not only explain the theory tools, but then show you how they apply directly to the fretboard. So if you think you're interested, again, just sign up with your email and I'll just keep you posted. And if you sign up through this link, of course, I'll make sure I give you a great deal when I do come out with the course and when it's finally finished and released. All right, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Today's topic is one of my favorites, and it is the most important. So I'm going to try to be as clear as I possibly can over here in a video. But of course, it's going to take a little time to explain everything. So again, the videos that I make are longer formats, and they require a bit of patience and a bit of focus, but hopefully the results are there, right? There's no such thing as learning music in, like they say sometimes, learn music in 2 weeks or in a month. It's absolutely impossible, okay? If somebody tells you this, they're lying, okay? You need this. Music takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes focus. So don't try to cut corners everywhere. Of course, you can make much more progress with good guidance and clear explanations, which is what I'm trying to offer here, but you're not going to become, the best guitarist in the world in a month or a year, even probably 2 years, maybe 10 years, okay? That's how long it takes, but you can accelerate your progress. So again, grab a cup of coffee, make yourself comfortable, and let's dive into today's subject, which is intervals. So I'm sure you've heard of intervals. Intervals. I don't know exactly what the best way of saying it is. Pardon me if I don't say it the right way. But I'm sure you've heard of that notion. And if you haven't heard of that notion, well, that's fine too. You'll get to hear about it today. But it is a crucial notion in music. It's crucial because intervals, the heart of the notion of intervals, is the study of the relationship between two notes. Okay? So it's kind of it's a very simple tool when you think about it, right? We're just going to study the relationship between two notes and how to name these relationships and what these relationships can tell us about what these two notes are going to sound like compared to one another. Okay, so if I have a note here and then at a certain pitch and then another note at another pitch, what can I expect of the sound of these two notes relative to one another? Knowing certain things, knowing the distance between these notes. How can I predict the sound of a note versus another? Now you might say, okay, but why do we spend time on this? And we spend time on this because, as it turns out, everything in music is a matter of relationship and relative distance between notes. So it becomes very important, and that's the case, by the way, with many, many notes. Even when you play big chords or scales, or when you're writing for a 50-piece ensemble, it's the relationship, the distance between the notes that is crucial. So because we're interested in relationship between all notes, it becomes very important to study the most simple relationship between notes, which is the relationship between just a simple group of two notes. So we're going to talk about intervals. I'm going to define intervals. Again, go back through why they are really important. And then we'll see that what's very important with intervals is, of course, to understand what they are and why they're important. Then that'll motivate you to get on to the next step, which is learning how to name intervals, right? It's important to name those relationships now that we established that they're important. And then it's also important to hear intervals and to be able to recognize those intervals by ear, because as we'll see, intervals are also kind of the foundation of ear training and of our ability to recognize and use musical tools. And finally, of course, we need to apply all this to the fretboard. So I will show you how you can study intervals on the fretboard. Okay, so why are intervals important? Why is this notion so commonly talked about everywhere? Maybe someone else has told you, hey, you need to study intervals. And it's true. Intervals is one of those things or those notions in music theory that if you understand intervals early on, everything else in music is going to be simple. And when I mean in music, it's mostly when it comes to your understanding of music theory and the development of your ear. But it also has impacts on your ability to solo, to compose, to transcribe. I mean, a lot of things, right? So if you understand intervals and if you can name them easily and recognize them easily, everything else is going to be very simple. And the opposite or the reverse is true, meaning that if you don't understand intervals well, unfortunately, everything else is probably going to be confusing, because you'll see often tools are described. When I mean tools, again, it's chords, scales, anything that you can use to make music are defined using the intervals that they are made of. And so if you don't understand that raw material, right, of the intervals, then understanding bigger tools such as scales, modes, all these things is going to be quite difficult. So it's worth spending a little time on this notion. It's worth really taking a step back and really making sure that you get this right. And I'm going to make sure I'll do everything I can for you to understand this notion as clearly as possible in this video. Everything in music is a matter of relationship, or I would say reference. This is due to the fact that a note on its own doesn't really have any musical value, right? If I play this note here, what can you say about this note? Well, you can name it. You can say it's an F sharp, which it is, or G flat. Again, a little ambivalence there. It can be either or. What else? You can say it's high maybe or low. You could talk about the volume maybe of that note, but that's about all you can say. There's no really emotional or real musical weight to that note. Now let's see what happens if I play this note with another note at the same time. Okay, now that note starts having, it sounds like something, right? You could say, oh, that's pretty, or that's sweet. To me, this sounds sweet, right? But the important thing to see is that these two notes seem to interact and create a color. So that note that was kind of neutral now becomes something different with the other note played at the same time. And if I change either of these notes, and I'm going to change the low one to show you that I can play that same F sharp here, and by just changing the other note that I'm playing with it, I'm changing the sound of the F sharp. Okay, now see how it changed everything? Let's do another one. Ooh. Okay, so now adjectives probably start coming to mind. You're thinking, oh, this sounds bad, or this sounds dissonant, or this sounds pretty, this sounds happy, this sounds sad. Again, that's the key here. Now F sharp starts to mean something in relationship to this other note. These two notes are creating a useful musical unit. These two notes are, you've guessed it, an interval. That is the definition of an interval, and I want you to remember this. An interval is a group of two notes. That's it. Definitions are crucial. They're really important in music theory. A lot of people don't really spend time wondering if they have their definitions right and trying to have that metacognition of thinking, okay, do I really understand this? Could I explain it to someone? If someone stopped me down the street and said, hey, what's an interval? Do I have a quick true answer that I could give and that's accurate, that's all encompassing, that's not just an example or, just a very confusing way of defining something. No, you need to know your definitions. That in and of its own kind of predicts whether or not you understand music theory. And this doesn't just apply to music theory, it applies to anything that you're trying to study. So an interval is a group of two notes. It is not the distance between two notes. A lot of people will tell you, well, no, an interval is the distance between two notes. And I get it, because interval has that notion, again, an interval of time is a gap, right? Has a notion of length. So I understand that, but really an interval is a group of two notes. It's a relationship between two notes. And of course, the distance plays a huge role in this relationship. Not only does it play a huge role, but it turns out that the sound of a note versus another one is uniquely determined by the distance between these two notes. So relativity, how far apart in pitch, so in pitch meaning in music, it would be in a number of steps or steps and half steps, how far apart two notes are will have a determining effect on how these two notes sound. Now, you don't have to play these two notes together to hear that relationship. If I play D and then F sharp, see, it has a similar sound than these two. And the reason why is that even though I'm playing these notes separately, I'm playing them close enough to one another that I preserve a retention of the first note in my short-term memory. And so your brain can still kind of establish this comparison between these two notes. So you can still recreate that interval of these two notes happening at the same time. But of course, the effect is greater when you really play the two notes at the same time. That's the best way to really hear how two notes sound together, or how an interval sounds. But you can also play those two notes separately. All these are intervals. An interval, the notes of which are played at the same time, is called a harmonic interval, right? Harmonic always has that notion of vertical, so played at the same time. If I played the notes of an interval separately, I would call it a melodic interval. Again, melody in music has this implicit notion of notes played separately, all right? So if I play the low note first and the high note second, it's called an ascending melodic interval. Makes sense. And if I played the high note first, it would be a descending melodic interval. But again, harmonic, melodic, ascending, or descending intervals doesn't matter. They all kind of have that same characteristic sound, which again is determined by the distance between the two notes. So to sum it up, again, intervals are a group of two notes. And what determines the sound of an interval is the distance in pitch. And therefore, you can count the distance between two notes in terms of number of half steps or steps plus half steps between the two notes. And it's that distance that determines the sound of the interval. So what's important here again is the notion of relativity. It doesn't matter which notes you're talking about. Here I had F sharp and D. Right, well, let's do it over here. There is two whole steps between these two notes. And the fact that there are two whole steps between these two notes predicts that it's going to sound like this. Again, it's so predictable that if you played the first note and you ask me how does F sharp sound above this note? Can you sing me an F sharp? With a little work, absolutely. I can sing it to you because, again, I know exactly, I can predict with 100% accuracy how F sharp sounds in relationship to D because I know the sound of this interval, of this distance. Now, let's say I moved this reference note. Let's say I move it up to or down to C. All right. If I play a note that's two whole steps above this new note, which is C, I will get the same characteristic sound. Make sure I get it right. But see, I can predict this and hear this because, again, everything is relative. So if I train myself to hear those relationships, those distances, it doesn't matter where I start. As long as I'm looking for the note that's 2 whole steps above that first note over here, I will get a similar or even an identical sound. It's not identical, of course, because it's not the same thing, but it's the same color. These 2 notes together create the same type of vibration or musical color. This is why relative pitch is much more important than absolute or perfect pitch in music. You've probably heard of these 2 notions. Someone that has perfect pitch can recognize notes, like actual notes. A machine that could play one note, like this, the first one I played, and they could say that's an F sharp. And they can recognize that exact frequency and associate it with the note. That is a skill that is very rare, and it's great, and you can absolutely use it, but it's not as useful as being able to recognize the relationship or the distance between 2 notes. Because again, it doesn't matter really which notes you play. What matters is the relative distance or relationship between all the notes. That's the reason why you can transpose a tune, for example. Transposing means changing the key or moving a whole tune up a certain number of, steps. For example, you could start playing a tune and maybe the singer says, "Hey, I can't sing that low. Can you move that tune up? Can you change the key?" And you absolutely can. And you can ask yourself that question. It's not obvious that you wouldn't completely destroy the sound of the original tune, right? The only reason why you can do that, and you can take a tune and take all the notes and move them up, and it sounds like the same tune, is because it's not about the notes themselves, absolutely. It's the relationship. So relative pitch, the ability to, again, be able to recognize the distance between notes, is much more useful than absolute pitch. Absolute pitch actually sometimes goes against your ability to have relative pitch because, for example, you can't really, it's hard for you to conceive of a tune in another key when you're really used to knowing the exact notes of a certain tune. And a lot of people with perfect pitch have problems with transposing like this. It's also a skill that you tend to lose as you get older, and when you start losing your absolute pitch or your perfect pitch, it becomes very problematic. So again, don't be upset if you don't have perfect pitch. It's okay, because you can develop incredible relative pitch. I would say that if you look at a bell curve, right, you have perfect pitch on one side. Very few people have perfect pitch. You have people that are tone deaf on the other side, which that's very sad. If you have that, I'm sorry. But that means that it's impossible for you to make a distinction between 2 different notes. And so it's really hard to develop even relative pitch when you're in that part of the population. But most people are in the meat of the bell curve here, where you can work on your relative pitch and become really good at recognizing the distance between 2 notes, which means, again, at recognizing intervals. So don't worry, I'm sure you fall into that category for most of you. And if you do have perfect pitch, it's okay. What it means is you should still try to develop your relative pitch, your ability to recognize intervals, and try to even sometimes purposely ignore the actual names of the notes so that you can really focus on relative pitch. That's my piece of advice. Okay, so what about bigger groups of notes? Let's say I have 5, 6, 7 notes happening at the same time. Well, intervals, when you think about it, it's like, if you had 5 planes flying at the same time in the sky, right? It could seem complicated to know what's going on with the altitudes of these planes. But it becomes easy if you measure the altitude of these planes with a common level. That's why, again, when you're a pilot, everyone agrees on where they start measuring altitudes, and they all use that same reference to measure the altitude of the planes. And so it becomes pretty simple to locate these planes, even relative to one another. If you're on a collision course, if you're on the same altitude, that's a problem, right? So it's going to be the same with intervals. When there's many notes played at the same time, what ends up happening is that naturally your ear will tend to use the lowest note as the reference from which you kind of measure or compare all the other notes. So essentially you can think of the lowest note as kind of this level, this ground level. And then all the other notes, which again will be higher than this bassier note, will have a specific relationship or make a specific interval with the low note. And so even a very large amount of notes you can actually compare and using intervals and study using intervals, because again, what's going to happen is your ear is going to take the lowest note, use this naturally as a reference, and measure or hear the intervals between all the other notes and that bass note. This is why in music, the root for a chord, which is the lowest note of a chord, the tonic, which is the lowest note of a scale, there's a specific importance given to the lowest note or to the bass note. That's also why all the tools in music tend to be defined from the lowest pitch to the highest pitch, right? You always define scales usually going up, chords going up. There's a reason for that. It's again because of the importance of the bass note in establishing these relationships and therefore in having that reference role. So again, the key here is that notion of reference. Everything in music, everything you play is a matter of relationship between the notes, right? Even if you consider a large amount of notes, they're all going to have a specific relationship. And there's always this notion, there's always going to be this one note that sticks out as the reference. And as a reference, you're going to be interested in the intervals that all of these notes make with this reference. And that doesn't matter if we're talking about chords, about melodies, about chords plus melodies. This is all happening. And again, it happens on the level of your experience listening and playing to music, right? So it has a real life, not just theory at this point, right? This is how we hear and experience music. But of course, this is also going to become very useful in music theory because as we'll see, we'll also use intervals to describe these tools, to describe chords, to describe scales, because if you can predict or understand how two notes are going to sound together, well, if you're playing three notes, for example, this, and you know how this interval sounds, so between the bass note and this note here, and this interval, well, the sum of these two intervals is going to make this new tool, which is this chord. Here it's a C major. Right? It's the sum of these two intervals happening at the same time that creates this new musical object. But so again, if you understand these smaller elements, these fundamental relationships or these intervals that chord can be broken down into, it'll be easy for you to kind of determine or predict or really understand how those intervals happening at the same time is going to sound, right? And again, you can hear when I play these how the bass note naturally has that grounding effect. Right? So that means that if I play it again, if I play these two notes but change the bass note, it really drastically changes the sound of these two higher notes because again, I'm changing my reference. So to make a quick metaphor here, think of intervals as colors when you're painting, all right? You have a certain number of colors that you can pick from when you're a painter. And of course, there's many, many more colors than there are intervals. We'll see there's only 12 intervals really. But think of these intervals as little colors. They each have a sound. They each have a characteristic. They also each have an application, just like colors, right? If you're going to paint a sky, what are you going to go for? You're probably going to go for some blue. And then if it's a sunset, you'll add some more colors and stuff. But it's going to be the same thing with intervals. They're going to be our basis for making music, because everything in music, again, is a combination of intervals. A scale is a group of intervals. A chord is a group of intervals happening at the same time. And just like colors, the color of one interval, or the sound in terms of music of one interval, will completely change when it's played at the same time as another interval. If you focus, you can retrieve that pure interval and then kind of hear those two intervals separately. Just like if you look at a painting, you can focus and see the colors that are actually used. But if you step back and look at the whole picture, you don't see these colors. You see a new thing. And it's the same here. Of course, C major is made of this interval and this interval. But when I play everything at the same time, it sounds like this new, deeper tool, this new, deeper object, right? It's not just this pure mathematical sum of those two intervals. But if you focus a little bit, I'm sure you can hear those two, right? They're kind of buried in there, but if you focus, you can hear them, right? And that's, again, an ear training exercise. So we'll see, just like colors, there is some colors that are a little harder to use, that when if you isolate that color, you'd say, well, I wouldn't want to paint my wall with this color, right? Or I wouldn't paint my car like that. But that color might be very useful in a specific situation. That's the color you need. It's going to be the same with intervals. And in just a second, we're going to go through all the intervals that we have available, and you'll see some of them sound a little, funny or dissonant. I'll give you some adjectives to describe intervals in a second here, but there are ones you'll be like, I never want to play this, but that's not true. You do want to play. You just need to learn where and how to use the color of that interval. And if you use it well, again, every interval has its use. Okay, so the fact that there are 12 notes in the musical alphabet, really, right? There are 12 different pitches, and then they repeat it every octave. That fact, and combined with the fact that the only thing that determines the sound of an interval is the distance between two notes, brings us to the logical conclusion that there really are only 12 different intervals, right? If I start with C, I can have C to C sharp. There'd be an interval that is, well, actually, let's step back. You could play C and C at the same time, right? That's also an interval. There is a distance of 0 steps between these two notes. We'll see it's called the unison, but it's still an interval that exists, right? So that's the smallest possible interval. And then C to C sharp or D flat, that's a half step. Then we have C to D, etc., etc. So I'm going to go up the notes starting with C, and finally I get C to B and C to C. And that's the distance of 6 full steps that's characteristic of our octave. Okay, and then it starts again, C to C sharp. But now you might be tempted to ask, and you're totally right if so, well, yeah, but at this point, the distance between C to C is 0. And the distance between C to C an octave above, it's 6 full steps. And you said that what determines the sound of an interval is the distance between the notes. Here there is a different distance, so they should sound different. So for example, here's the same E twice, so unison. And right, you can still tell, right? It's not the same as just playing one E, right? Twice the same one. But now here's the octave. Okay, so what can you say of the difference between that unison and the octave? Well, they're different, but again, the octave is the reason why we even have octaves is because they're so similar to unisons. That's why we started the musical alphabet. Again, if you look at the video on notes that I made over here, if you're confused about this, you can watch this video. But I talk about this, right? It's the reason why there is such a thing as an octave and why we call this note the same as this one is because playing twice the same note or playing that note and the note an octave above produces such a similar effect. So it turns out that if you're starting intervals again after the octave, they're going to have a very similar sound than the intervals that are within one octave. So C to C sharp or C to C sharp that's found an octave above are going to have a fairly similar sound. It's not exactly the same. Turns out, we'll talk a little bit about this, but dissonant intervals that are wider tends to soften dissonances. So the displeasing or unsettling or kind of clashing sound of two notes together tends to kind of become a little milder as the interval is bigger if those two notes are far away apart. But again, in the grand scheme of things, really what you need to focus on is the intervals within an octave. Because once you look at intervals that are bigger than an octave, so an interval plus an octave plus 2 octaves, which by the way are called compound intervals. These intervals have a very similar sound, so you don't have to spend too much time with this. You really need to focus on the intervals within an octave. So again, kind of wrap all this up, that means that we really have 12 intervals to make music, 12 different colors. And what I want to do right now is play these 12 different intervals and start giving some characteristics or names, qualities to these intervals, okay? And we're going to do this, and then we're going to go into the naming of intervals, which is going to take us a little time because it can be a little tricky. And then we'll go into a little more ear training and finally intervals on the fretboard. So I'm going to play E as a constant note in the background. And then I'm going to start with E and play all the notes within this octave from E to E. So E, F, F sharp, etc. All right? And I want you to listen until we reach the octave. Listen and start thinking to yourself, what do you think of the sound of these intervals? Where would you use them? Do they sound good, bad, whatever it is, okay? One of the first things you can say again is some intervals seem to sound quote unquote better than others. Some intervals seem easier to listen to, or they sound like the notes don't clash together. They kind of work together to make something pretty and stable. This phenomenon is known as consonance, and that is one of the first characteristics of intervals is consonance, or the lack of consonance, or the opposite of consonance, which is dissonance, okay? So, for example, you probably thought that that interval here is fairly consonant. On the other hand, this one, right? Like you almost have like some sort of you want it to stop, or there's something, it feels like those two notes don't fit well together. So again, that doesn't mean you don't want to start putting meliorative or pejorative adjectives behind intervals. Don't say this sounds bad, because again, that would be like looking at a color that in of its own or by itself doesn't look the best. Like again, would you want to paint your house with this color? Probably not. Would you want to make a tune that just uses this interval the whole time? No, you would probably ask me to stop at some point, right? This interval though, could probably play this for a little bit in the background. It wouldn't bother you again because these two notes sound pretty good together, right? So it'd be like painting your walls white or something. Like it won't bother anyone. But again, each interval has its utility. So this interval, for example, that sounds like something cool. And again, it's because I put this interval into a context, into a real musical context. That would be like using this weird color in exactly the right spot on a painting that makes the exact type of shadow that you need or something. Now you're like, oh, I really needed this color there. If I didn't have that color there, it would not have completed my painting. And that's the same here. So when you hear this here, sounds very Middle Eastern. And Middle Eastern scales rely a lot on that interval over here to make their music. If you took that interval away from them saying, nah, that interval sounds bad, don't play it, well, their whole music falls apart, right? So don't say this sounds good or bad. Say it's dissonant. Yes, it's true. It is dissonant. And so therefore it has to be used in the correct context. And it's probably going to be used more sparsely or less often than intervals that are consonant. The consonant intervals you'll tend to find pretty much everywhere in every type of music, in most scales and chords, because again, they release tension, and there is some physics and acoustics behind consonants that make these notions or these intervals fairly universal. But when it comes to the other intervals, the ones that are a little more difficult to listen to, well, it's going to change depending on the context, the traditions, the type of music, the culture, whatever. You're going to find these dissonances and more unique intervals used in different ways. I really hope this makes sense, right? Again, a long video just to talk about groups of two notes, but hopefully you can start seeing the power of intervals, and that'll motivate you to then do the other things, which are naming intervals, and which can take some time. So consonant intervals, dissonant intervals. Other emotions that you can attach to intervals are, some of them to me sound fairly happy, I would say, like this one, right? Some a little darker. And again, that's cultural, right? There maybe to some other people that's not the case. It can also be subjective, but typically, if you're born in a Western country and you're listening to everyone's the same pop music or rock music or whatever, you'll think that this sounds happier than this, and that's probably because this interval was given to you or fed to you musically over in happy contexts, and this one in sad context. Okay, so this brings us to the next question, which is how am I going to name these intervals? I know again that the thing that makes an interval sound the way it sounds, like we saw, is the distance between these two notes. So how do I name, for example, an interval that's, let's say, 3/2 steps, which you could say 1.5 steps as well? How do I name this interval? Well, here's the problem. That is not a straightforward answer. There's not going to be just one name associated with an interval that has a specific distance. And the reason for that is this concept that we've already seen that's going to have repercussions in music theory everywhere. And it's the fact that you can name specific pitches in music with different letters or different notes, right? For example, you all know that D sharp and E flat correspond to the same pitch, right? D sharp and E flat, even though I'm saying two different things, they both refer to the same spots on the fretboard. So it's not just a matter of distance when it comes to naming, because we want to be precise when naming intervals. Since an interval is a group of two notes, and again, not just the distance between two notes, I want to know which two notes I'm talking about, not just how far apart they are. And again, it might not be clear why that's important right now. And that's one of those things in music where one of the things that I believe is a problem when learning music theory is that you discover the utility of some of the early on notions, such as, sharps and flats and intervals having the same names and stuff. You discover the utility, the real utility of these notions much later on as you discover or explore more complicated tools. And so you kind of have these retrospective aha moments where you look back later on, you're like, oh, that's why we did this, or we set up the system the way it's set up. But for a little time, you have to just trust in the way the system was built. So let's take an example. Let's say I'm looking at C to D sharp as an interval, or C to E flat. So let's play this interval. For example, here you have C and D sharp, or C and E flat, which of course is going to sound exactly the same. So in both cases, there are 1.5 steps between those two notes. Yet, these two intervals are going to have different names because in one case, I'm talking about a D, and the other one, I'm talking about an E. Even though there's a sharp and a flat, so there's an accidental, I'm referring to different notes, and we need to take this into account, this difference into account when naming intervals. So you'll find that there are many ways, just like in notes, there's several ways and many ways actually to name the same pitch. We're going to have intervals that have the same sound, but in the same distance, because there's the same distance between the notes, but not the same name. And that concept is called enharmony. So C and D sharp, that interval is enharmonic to C to E flat. Okay, so now how do we build our system for naming intervals? And for that, we are going to use one of our most beloved tools in music theory, which is the major scale. Again, the major scale is fundamental in the construction and establishment of Western music theory, whether it's classical music, but even modern music theory. So how does the major scale come in? Well, remember, we're still measuring distances, okay? That's kind of it's one of the most fundamental aspects of intervals is we are interested in how far apart these notes are. But we're not just interested in how far apart they are in terms of pitches, so steps and half steps. We also want to know how far apart they are in the musical alphabet, meaning letter-wise, okay? So when I say, I'll give you an example. If I say C to D sharp and C to E flat, these two intervals have the same distance in terms of pitches. But when it comes to the letters that I'm using, in the first one, I'm using letters C and D. So my notes are not that far apart in the musical alphabet. Actually, I'm using the first note, C, and second note above C, which is D. Now, of course, there's a sharp in there, but it doesn't matter. I'm using the letter D, which is the second letter above C in the musical alphabet. In the second interval, C to E flat, notice how, again, the distance is the same, but in terms of how far apart the letters are, well, now I'm using letters C and E. And again, yes, there's a flat, but that doesn't matter. I'm describing this interval using letters C and E, which are 3 rankings apart, right? If I start my musical alphabet starting with C, okay? So there's going to be this double aspect of measuring here where you're measuring the distances in steps and half steps, but you also want to take into consideration how far apart the notes are in the musical alphabet. Again, hang in there. I know it can be a little difficult, so I'm trying to be as clear as possible. I'm going to give you some metaphors, some examples, and I really hope that you understand by the end of this video. Okay, so let's start with a simple metaphor. What do you do when you make a ruler? The point of a ruler, of course, is to measure objects, right? Distances, physical distances. So a ruler is a real-life object, right, that has a given distance. Then the first thing that you choose is you decide which unit you're going to use to measure objects with this ruler. So if you can use the metric system or, inches and stuff like that. And then you're going to divide this object into a certain number of graduations that correspond to whichever unit you decided you were going to use. Then what do you do if I want to measure, for example, this pick or this pen over here? I would take my ruler and I would align the first graduation with this part and then look at where that second end of the pen over here ends on my ruler. And I'll have another graduation here. If it turns out that that second end lands exactly on a graduation that I have, it's very easy. For example, let's say that that's 4 inches. So I would put here first graduation, and then I would read on the fourth one and say, okay, this thing is 4 inches. All right. So again, bear with me here. I'm trying to build this metaphor. One thing to realize here is that the first graduation, right? Notice how I say the first graduation corresponds to a distance of 0, right? If something measured 0, it would just be this one little line on the first graduation, okay? So a distance of 0 is associated with the first graduation. Measure something that's 1 inch, there will be the first graduation, so the second end will land on the second graduation. So 1 inch, second graduation. 2 inches, third graduation. Okay, there's a difference between the distances and the numbered graduations that you're gonna read, okay? Now let's say my pen is not 4 inches, it's actually in the middle of the third and the fourth graduation. So now how am I gonna describe the distance of this pen over here, or the length of this pen, sorry? I'm going to use the surrounding graduations and then add 1/2 inch, right? So I would say, for example, okay, well, it's 3.5 inch. And standardly, that's how we do it when it comes to measuring objects, right? 3 plus 1/2. But technically, you could also say, well, it's 4 inches minus 1/2 step. That's also correct. In fact, there's an infinite possibilities for naming this. You could say, well, it's 2 inches plus 1.5, or it's 2 inches plus 1.5 inches, right? It's not really convenient to measure it like that. It's much easier to say 3.5 inches, but 4 inches minus 1/2 also works. 2 inches plus 1.5 inch also works, right? There's many ways of describing the size of this pen over here, even with our normal graduation system. Okay, so now let's say we're going in the world of music, and I want to measure the distance between C and D sharp, for example, or C and E flat. Well, the first thing to do is to establish our ruler, our graduation. Where do we put our graduations when we're measuring intervals? How do we calibrate that ruler? We are going to calibrate it using the major scale. Remember the major scale? The major scale divides an octave in a certain sequence of whole steps and half steps. And so from the first note of a scale, you're going to go up a whole step, then another whole step, then a half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and half step. And then you land back again on the same note. So a major scale, first note is going to be our first graduation. And then we go up 1, that's our second graduation. Another whole step, that's our third graduation. A half step, and then we have our fourth, whole step, fifth, whole step 6, whole step 7, and half step 8th, or it would be technically the 8th graduation. But of course, remember, that corresponds to the same note when you talk about a major scale. We're really going to focus on measuring intervals within an octave, and then we'll talk a little bit about bigger intervals. So that's our ruler here, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And these are whole steps and these are half steps. So interesting to notice that our ruler, unlike with a normal ruler, in this case here, the graduations aren't separated equally, all right? We're not using, and that's because, again, our main tool in the Western world, our reference is the major scale. And so it turns out the major scale is asymmetrical. It's not just always the same distance between the notes. So to begin simply, let's start about how to name the intervals that land on a graduation, right? So let's start about basically naming the intervals that are in the major scale. For example, C to D, okay? If I want to measure that, I put C on the first graduation, D on the second graduation, right? And the distance over here is 1 whole step between these two notes. Because that note is in that major scale that starts with C over here, it will be given the name of major second. Now I want to stop here for a second. Every interval is going to have that type of first name, last name in the way that you describe them. Major second, perfect fifth, diminished fourth, etc. And what's important to notice is that the second part, which we call the number, when I say major second, right? That second part describes, again, which graduation I'm landing on when I measure my note, or which graduation I'm taking as my reference. And the number uniquely corresponds to how far apart the letters are in the musical alphabet. Remember this. So for example, why is C to D, with C on the bottom, D on top, a second? Because if I count up my musical alphabet from C, I get C, D. Remember, C will land on my first graduation, so D, therefore, will be my second graduation. All right? What's the number of interval C to F, for example? C, D, E, F. So C to F is going to be a fourth. All right? And again, it doesn't matter how many sharps or flats I put on my notes. It doesn't matter, because here I'm trying to find out which letters I'm talking about. And then the sharps and the flats are going to adjust that distance. They're going to change the quality of the interval, which is that first name, but it doesn't impact the fact that I'm talking about a C, I'm talking about an F, so it's a fourth. Okay, so now what about the qualities? Well, let's take again our little thing over here, our little major scale. The intervals in the major scale are mostly going to be named major because they are in the major scale. So for example, if you go up to the second here, the interval between this note and this note, I'll take C to D, for example, I just said is a major second. Here, major third. What about the fourth? Would the interval between C, for example, and F be a major fourth? Well, no. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There are a few exceptions. With the fourth and the fifth and the octave, they're not going to be called major, even though they're in the major scale. They will be called perfect. All right? So, again, if I want to establish my ruler over here, I start a major scale. The interval between the first and the second is, right? The first note and the second note is a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, we're back to normal, major seventh, and perfect eighth, which we actually don't say eighth, we say octave, which means the same thing. By the way, if you were to measure the distance between a note and itself here, so with a distance of 0, we're staying on that first graduation, we would say a perfect unison and not a first. Okay, so at this point, you should already be able to name intervals, provided that those two intervals are part of a major scale, right? So for example, if I say F to A, and I'm like, what's that interval? F on the bottom, A on top. Your reflex should always be the same. First of all, think of the number of that interval. F, G, A. So it's going to be a third. No matter what happens with the distances, it'll be a third. And then you just start F over here, and you start building a major scale starting from F. F goes up a whole step to G, goes up a whole step to A. So because A lands on that graduation here, if I start my major scale, I don't have to think about it. It's a major third, all right? F to B flat would be F, G, A, up a half step to B flat. That's a perfect fourth, right? Unfortunately, it's not major fourth. You have to remember this. For a fourth, it's a perfect fourth, right? That's the quality. The first name, by the way, I don't think I said that. The first name of an interval is called the quality of that interval. Notice that I said B flat here, not A sharp. Why? Because F to A sharp is not a fourth. Why is it not a fourth? Because F, G, A A is a third above F. So again, doesn't matter how many sharps and flats I'm putting in there. If I talk about the letter F and the letter A, it is going to be a third. And then I'll tweak that name with the quality. It'll be what we'll see. It would be an augmented third, but it's still some sort of third. That's very important. Okay, so now how do we measure intervals, the notes of which don't land on my graduations here of the major scale? For example, we already did one, C to D sharp. D sharp's in the middle here. How do we name that interval? Well, we need to understand how qualities change when they go away from their position in the major scale. All right? And the logic is pretty simple, but sometimes it takes a little bit to get used to. So again, if you're in the major scale, your interval is major or perfect. Okay, so we want to draw a category over here. There is the category of the major intervals and the perfect intervals. And the qualities are going to be slightly different for the two. If my interval is major, for example, major second, and so major second, there is a whole step between those two notes. But if I stretch this interval or shrink it by using sharps or flats, the quality will change as such. If the interval is a half step smaller, it will become minor. So if I took C to D here, and it took D and made it a D flat, so now it's down a half step, I shrunk my interval by a half step, it's no longer a major second, it's a minor second. I can shrink this interval again. I could go C to D flat, flat. Remember, you can flatten sharpen notes as many times as you want. And again, that really confuses people, but it's the way the system is built. And for the most part, it's going to grant you some names that make sense for intervals. But if you push that system a little bit too much, you'll sometimes get things that are not super useful, intuitive. But it doesn't matter. That's how the system works, right? Every system can break. So bear with me here. C to D flat, flat. Well, D goes down to D flat, goes down to D flat, flat. We're literally landing back on the same note over here. We're talking about basically the same thing as a perfect unison. But again, because I'm talking about a C and a D that I flattened twice, it's a second. And it's going to be not a minor second, that would be C to D flat, but a diminished second. So major minus a half step, minor minus a half step, diminished. You could even go down again, flatten one more time, and that would be a double diminished, triple diminished. But again, you're not going to see that often. That would be the equivalent, remember in my ruler, of measuring something and say, that pen is 2 and 1.5 steps. It doesn't make sense to say that. Why not use a graduation that makes much more sense, which would be 3.5 steps, all right? I can name or describe the length of my pen using math in an infinite number of ways, but there is going to be a measurement that makes the most sense. It's going to be the same with intervals. So am I going to use the diminished second often? Absolutely not, right? Because at this point, I might as well just say unison. There are some rare cases where a weirder name for an interval makes more sense, and that depends on the context, right? It depends on the context. For example, if I wanted to measure this pen, but measure this part plus the cap, well, then maybe it makes sense to say that that's 2 and then 1.5 over here. Because now there is a context that makes my weird measurement make more sense. Okay, so now what if I look at C to D sharp? That's the interval we were working on since the beginning here. That interval is a half step bigger than the major second, and therefore it will be called an augmented second. So again, it makes sense, right? Bigger, augmented, smaller, minor, and diminished. Okay, there's that notion of a little bit smaller, a lot smaller. Same thing, I could go D sharp, sharp. That would be double augmented, triple augmented, etc. But you'll hardly ever see these. For intervals that are normally perfect, so the fourth, the fifth, the octave, and the unison, these bypass the minor quality. So if I have a perfect fourth and I make it a half step smaller, it directly becomes diminished. And if I make it a half step bigger, it becomes augmented. And then there's that whole, double augmented, double diminished. Technically, you can do this. We know that C to D sharp is not a major second, but an augmented second. C to E flat. Well, again, the process is always the same. I start my major scale, C, D, E. Oh, first of all, it's a third because C, D, E. E is the third letter above C. Then, does it land on my graduation of the major scale? No. So it's not a major third. It's a half step smaller. Therefore, it's a minor third. So the minor third is enharmonic to the augmented second. All right? Okay, so let's do one together so that you start understanding the process. And again, this is very important. Don't try to bypass the process. You will fail. Don't try to think, well, I don't see sharps or flats, so that's a major interval. Like, the only thing that's true is that system that I gave you, and I'm going to repeat in just a second over here. If you start to try to use your gut at this point, you will fail. You will not name the intervals right. And I'll give you a tricky example just so you can see that, okay? Don't use the presence or absence of flats or sharps in the two notes. Remember, that's not what determines, it has an impact, but it's not what determines the name of the interval. The name of the interval is determined by, start with the low note of the interval, I make a major scale, right? And then I look at if the second note of my interval is on a note of that major scale, right? If it corresponds to a note of that major scale. If so, it will be a major or perfect interval. If not, we'll have to change the quality, okay? And again, the number just depends on which letters I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Let's look at the interval B to F, okay? So it's a tricky one, a standard trick, because people see B to F. So first thing, you count. B, C, D, E, F. So it's a fifth. Again, doesn't matter, sharps, flat, that's a fifth. And then what people tend to do here is say, well, there's no sharps and flats, so it's probably a perfect fifth. But that's not true. That would be misunderstanding what a major scale is. A major scale is not no sharps, no flats. It's a specific sequence. So again, do the process. B, a whole step above B is C sharp, because there's only a half step between B and C. D sharp. E is on the fourth here. And E plus a whole step is F sharp. So B to F sharp is a perfect fifth. What was the interval we were talking about? B to F. Oh, well, that's a half step smaller than B to F sharp. So B to F, the interval BF, is a diminished fifth, even though there's no sharps and no flats, okay? So you might think, is that going to always take that much time? No, okay? First of all, you get really fast at it. Second of all, you'll start learning some intervals. You'll start like C to E is a major third. I pretty much know most of my intervals by heart because I've used them so many times. So that's something you need to practice, okay? And we'll see how you can do this. But you need to practice this. You need to test yourself with intervals. The other thing that you'll be able to do is you'll be able to deduce an interval that you don't know from an interval that you know. For example, if I know that C to E is a major third, well, and as someone asks me what's C to E flat, it's really simple. C to E is a major third, so C to E flat is a half step smaller, it's a minor third, right? So having a bank of intervals that you know really well is going to help you name other intervals that are not as immediate or that you don't know directly. Okay, so finally, until we get into a quick exercise on how you can, name intervals or practice naming intervals, the final way I would like to have you see and visualize intervals is by seeing them as a circle, like the notes, right? Notes are circular. If I start with C, I go C, D, E, F, G, etc., and I go up my circle, and then I get back to my first note, etc., etc. Intervals are the same. You're going to have, on the top of your circle, you're going to have the 1, right, which is your first graduation, the unison. And then if you go up a whole step, you have your major second, whole step major third, half step perfect fourth, whole step perfect fifth, whole step major 6, whole step major 7, and last half step you get back to the 1. So it would be an octave technically, but again, remember, an octave or a unison have a very similar function in terms of the sound that they have. So you can say an octave, you can say, a unison. In many contexts, it doesn't matter, but of course, technically, it's an octave. By the way, I just realized I forgot to put in the video what it means when I write down 2, for example, as a notation for an interval. So standardly, if you write just a number like this without anything before that number, that refers to this interval being major. Or in the case, of course, of a fourth or a fifth or a unison / octave, it would refer to the interval being perfect, all right? If you see a sharp or a flat, that indicates that I'm moving away from this quality. So for example, a sharp 2 would refer to what's 1/2 step bigger than the major second, which would be augmented second. A flat 2 would be minor second. A diminished second, you'd have to put flat, flat 2. All right, that's diminished second. And finally, for fourth and fifth, of course, because these don't get minor, they're just perfect, diminished, or augmented, a flat 5 is directly a diminished fifth. Having that circle in mind is a great tool, and it's going to be really amazing specifically when it comes to navigating the fretboard, because sometimes, for example, if I want to get a major 7, and we'll see this might be a little bit too advanced right now, but understand that if I start with 1, go all the way around the circle to get to my major 7, which is a half step away, right, a half step lower than my octave, which would mean going back to the same note. Well, a simple way of reaching a major 7 on the fretboard, for example, rather than going all the way up, is to just go down a half step. Because again, if I start from 1 and go down a half step, I also have a major 7 there. So having that circle, visualizing intervals as a circle like this is also very, very useful. So what happens if you do go past an octave? C to D, that's an octave above, for example. Well, numbers or graduations just keep going up. After the 8th or the octave would be the 9th, then the 10th, then the 11th. But realize that, again, so a 9th is a second plus an octave. And it's going to have a very, very similar sound to the second. So you can totally just say a second plus an octave. The only times that using those compound names, 9th, 10th, 11th, etc., is useful, and we'll see this in much later lessons, is when you are referring to the extensions of a chord. For example, a C add 9 is different sounding than a C add 2. A 9th in this case indicates that I want this note D, the 9th, to be on a higher range way above the root of my chord as opposed to buried inside, and in this case you would probably say a second. But even then that rule is broken so many times in chord nomenclature, and if you played a C add 2 instead of a C add 9, it would not be catastrophic. You would still get the same basic result. So how do you practice this? Very simple. If you looked at my first video, a tool I love to use is the random note picker, and I'll put a link in the description here. You can set 2 notes in the random note picker, so it'll generate 2 notes from left to right, and you can use that left note as your low note, the right note as your high note, and just name the interval, right? The cool thing with this is that they're all unpredictable. They're random intervals, so you can use these to practice naming even some weird intervals, because sometimes since it's a random generator, it'll generate some weird things. Now, the only problem with this is you don't have a way to check yourself. So make sure you're already pretty good before you start doing this. At the beginning, what I recommend is use some of the free resources that I'm going to have available here. I'm going to give you a series of exercises of intervals. And again, you can access them if you enter your email on my website. I will send you the links to all these resources. There's not just that, there's resources on tables of intervals of all the main intervals, that circle of intervals. There's all sorts of things. Make sure that you go down there, click on the link, enter your email, and I'll send you that, and exercises that include the correction. So if you can, do the exercise, make sure you do them without cheating, and then there is the correction of these exercises. And if you need any help, of course, you can contact me. Okay, so now let's talk about the ear training portion of intervals. How do you practice recognizing intervals? And really, there's a few things that you need to be able to do. The first thing is, like I said, recognize an interval. If I just played any groups of 2 notes, all right, I hear these 2 notes and I immediately think major 6th, okay? Now, you might be tempted to think, well, what about the intervals that are named differently but that sound the same? In this case, well, you have some leeway. It doesn't matter really, right? If I played this, that can technically be a minor 6th or an augmented 5th. They are both correct. In context, there's probably one that makes more sense than the other. But without a context, I could say either or, and they would both be correct. So whatever you want. The important part here is that I can recognize that unit. I can recognize the distance between these 2 notes and put a name on it. Easiest way to start doing this is to start recognizing intervals played as ascending melodies like this. Right, it's easier at first than if you try to play them at the same time. Usually when you do this, at the beginning you'll have to try to artificially, or not artificially, but in your mind, separate those 2 notes, sing them as a melody, and then you can find a name. Same with descending. Often it takes a little bit of time, and at the beginning you have to kind of reverse the order in your mind to really name that descending melodic interval. So to get good at this, really what you need to start doing is first draw a table of intervals and think about which ones are consonant or dissonant, okay? For some people, it's a little bit different, but mostly people agree on the most consonant and the most dissonant intervals, okay? So you can put them into 2 different categories, and that can help you. It can already guide you, right? For example, the octave and the unison are, of course, the most consonant intervals. The minor second is very dissonant, right? It's the most dissonant interval. The major second is a little less dissonant, but still has some crunch, right? And again, physically, that's because these notes are close to the unison, and the waves actually clash together. The minor third is, to me, consonant. To some people, a little dissonant. To me, it's consonant, but it's dark, kind of sad. The major third, to me, is very consonant, and it's more open or light or joyful. The perfect fourth is consonant. The augmented fourth or diminished fifth, which is the tritone. We call it the tritone, right? Because it's 3 full steps. It splits the octave in half, right? It's the middle of our ruler. Perfect fifth is really consonant. The minor sixth, some people say it's dissonant. I think it's got some dissonance. But mostly it's dark. As opposed to the major sixth, which is again a little more open or happy. A lot of people have a hard time at first between minor major third and minor and major sixth because they both have that little bit of crunch or dissonance, but one is dark or sad, the other one is a little happier. Minor seventh, again we start having some dissonance there. Major seventh, a lot of dissonance. Because again, we're a half step before resolving the dissonant to the most consonant interval, octave. So the minor second and the major seven, because they're both a half step away from that the most consonant interval, which is the unison or the octave, these two intervals are going to be the most dissonant. They really want to resolve. Those waves really clash together. So you'll have a document again in that you get if you enter your email there, and I'll give you some tips and advice here on how you can actually categorize these intervals. There'll be a PDF on this. But I will say that the most useful thing to do when it comes to start recognizing intervals is, for one, try to be aware of them. Like I said, try to listen for them in tunes when you're listening on the radio. Like, start thinking about these groups of two notes and how they sound, and then practice putting a name on them. And the most useful way, and it's the standard way that it's taught in the ear training, in the ear training science, I would say, is to think of a tune that you know that begins with an interval, or the interval that you're trying to name. So to associate each interval with the two first notes of a tune that you know. For example, for the minor third, which is this one over here, right? This one makes me think of Smoke on the Water immediately. And so again, I hear this, boom, minor third. And now I don't have to think about Smoke on the Water anymore, but for a long time, that's what I used to recognize that interval. So I would hear this, and I would say, oh, that sounds, that's a minor third, right? And then you can bypass that step. Each interval you'll see has corresponds to a tune. I guarantee you know the two first notes of which make this specific melodic interval, okay? That is the best way of doing it. Now, if you really want to get serious about this, I'll put a link in the description. I recommend that you get the best ear training software out there, and it is called EarMaster. Now, I am affiliated with EarMaster, so I can give you the discount code down there. It's fairly inexpensive. It's really worth it. And again, I have no shame in saying that I am affiliated with EarMaster. I am affiliated because I made a video on how I used it and how cool I thought it was. And then they were like, hey, thanks for the video. Do you want to put a discount code? So it went this way around, right? They didn't reach out to me first. I've been using that software for over 10 years. And I think, over 10 years. And it is amazing. And the cool thing with EarMaster is that it generates, first of all, it's really well made. All the modules are well built. It's a step-by-step progression, starts with simple intervals. They have a great table with a bunch of songs that's, like I said, that have these intervals as their first two notes, ascending and descending. So it's very step-by-step, well made. But most importantly, the problem with intervals is that if you really want to get good at ear training, you need to be surprised by the interval. You can't, if you play the interval, you can already kind of guess what it is because you're the one playing it. When it's an interval that someone else plays or that's randomly generated like an EarMaster, then there's no cheating, right? You have to just use your ear to recognize the interval. So the fact that it generates random intervals like this and has you name them is incredible. I owe literally all of my ear training skills, at least the beginning when I started in this journey, to EarMaster. And then they go up. It's not just intervals. You can then go up to triads, tetrads, scales, rhythm. I mean, everything. This software should be in every musician's toolbox. All right. That is for the ear training part of intervals. So become comfortable naming intervals. Become quicker, and try to get to the point where this is how it should feel. You hear two notes, interval. It's the same as colors, right? Colors are not obvious. We're not born knowing how to name blue. But when you're a kid, your parents say that's blue, 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 and then after a while, you don't have to think about it. Right now, I'm seeing many different colors. I'm not really thinking about them, but if you ask me, what's the color of this? Like my guitar case here, I'd say it's green, all right? It's immediate. I don't have to think about it. And that's how intervals should be for you at some point. I play two notes, random notes, major 6, right? I'll just play them here. Tritone. 4th. That's actually another good way of surprising yourself. You just play a drone note and then you just play a random note on the fretboard. That's the 1. That's Now, let's take this and finally put all this in application to our fretboard. So, because of the way the fretboard is designed, intervals are going, just like chords, are going to have specific shapes. And depending on whether you want to play this interval harmonically or melodically, you're going to have different options to play intervals. So for example, if I start with A over here, and I want to go up a minor second, which is up a half step, how can I go up a half step? Well, the first option, of course, is melodically. If I don't need to play these two notes at the same time, I can go on the same string up to the next fret. So that's a minor second over here. That doesn't allow me, though, to play these intervals these two notes, or this interval harmonically. So how would I do it if I want to play harmonically? Well, I have to go down 1, 2, 3, 4 frets and up to the next string. All right, rule of thumb, if something is really close on the same string, it's going to be pretty far away on two different strings. It makes sense if you think about it for just a little bit. So this is just here. So if I want to get this on another string, I'm going to have to stretch a bit. Is there another option? Not really. From this reference here on my E string, that's going to be my two main shapes for minor seconds. These two shapes are going to be the same, by the way, if I have my low note of my interval on the A string. Same on the D string. And here we have a problem. Once again, why do we have a problem? Because of the stupid B string. All right, the B string, remember, is 2.5 steps lower than all the other strings relative to one another, right? They're all a fourth apart, but G to B is a major third. We're lacking a half step. So if I did this, I would now not be playing a minor second, but a unison. So I need to go up a half step. All the shapes, when they encounter or encompass the B string, are modified, and the high note needs to go up a half step compared to when the root is on any other string. Okay? Example, for example, is the major 6. Here's a major 6, and I can also get the major 6 like this, right? You see, some intervals have several options harmonically and melodically. But now, if I started with the root on the D string, because I encounter again the B string over here, that's not going to be a major 6 anymore. I need to go up here. That would be a minor 6. And same thing, if my root is on the G string, I still encounter the B string. The B string is encompassed between those two notes. So this is not a major 6 in this case. I need to go up here. And if I wanted to go to my second option, which remember here was like this, well, the same thing is going to happen. Now, that's a minor 6 because, again, B string. So that would be my major 6. Okay, so I don't want to spend time here. This was a long enough video. I don't want to spend time going through all the shapes of all the intervals. What's important is that each interval is associated to one or several options depending on where you put the low note of your interval, all right? Or the high note if you're descending. Again, so it depends on which sets of strings you're playing the shape of that interval. But each interval has a certain number of shapes associated with it. So again, there'll be a document linked in the description here if you enter your email, and I'll give you all the shapes of all the intervals on the fretboard. Again, these shapes are totally movable horizontally on the fretboard. Of course, because the way the guitar is made, if I take a shape and that there's a specific distance between these two notes, if I move up a half step, that same distance is still, or there's still the same distance between these two notes. So once I found a shape, I can move it horizontally. And for the most part, you can also move the shapes vertically, except again, when you start encountering the B string, where you're gonna have to slightly modify the shape by taking the higher note and going up a half step. Okay guys, that's it with intervals. One thing we haven't explored in this video that we will once we discover or we talk about the cage system, and I had to talk about intervals before we get into triads and cage system and all that stuff, is the ability to find different intervals in each shape of the cage system, not necessarily as intervals per se, but more as chord tones, right? Put ourselves in the reference, for example, of this E shape. Knowing where all the seconds are in this shape is going to be very important if you want to add these notes or intervals to a chord, all right? Or if you want to find them in pentatonic scale or any scale, right? Gaining that shape, that caged shape knowledge of intervals is going to be really, really important. In this case, we'll measure everything from the reference of that shape, which is going to be the root of the chord or the tonic of the scale. It's a slightly different approach to intervals, but again, the concept is the same. All right? So, I know this was an intense video. I really did my best to communicate and explain clearly why intervals are important, what they are, how to name them, how to practice hearing them, right? Using Earmaster and all these things, and then how to find them on the fretboard. There are other exercises that you can find if you enter your email. Clicking on the link below over here will take you to my website, and enter your email. You'll get an access to a drive link with all the stuff, and you can start applying, and you'll have more exercises. I could talk more about intervals. You might have a bunch of questions. Feel free to ask those questions in the description. I will read the comments and answer them. Again, if you like these videos and you'd like to support me, subscribe to the channel, click the little bell icon. If you want more explanation, if you want more details, there's several ways that we can make this happen. One, my books. They're fairly inexpensive. Please get them. There's a link to Amazon down there. They're really worth it, I think, and they'll help you with music theory. If you want to go one step further, again, sign up here, and as soon as my online course is done, I will send you an email with a big discount so that you can be the first to on board, and we will go through these notions in even more depth, with more exercises, more access to me, all these things, all right? And finally, if you want to go all in and you're just ready, you want to get all this theory absorbed quickly, and you really want to put effort into it, and you're ready for it, and you have the time and the means, then of course I offer one-on-one mentoring, one-on-one coaching. It's a 3 to 4 month program. We sign up together and I become your personal mentor here. You can access my phone all the time, every day. I answer, with videos. We exchange. We'll basically become music buddies for a while, and I will teach you everything I know with one goal in mind. It's to make sure that you understand everything about music theory and how to navigate the fretboard so that you are never confused again, and you can, go on with confidence in your music journey. I really appreciate everyone watching here. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.